Hi, everybody. This week we are going to continue in the 20th century, but this time we're going to emphasize our American composers. And it isn't until the 20th century that American composers really show up because prior to the 20th century, most American composers are really just kind of copying what the Europeans are doing. It really isn't until the 20th century where the American composers take the music of America and use that uh, to make classical, uh, quote unquote, compositions. So we're going to be introduced this week to Scott Joplin, a great African American composer at the turn of the century from the 1890s into 1900. And Scott Joplin was called America's Chopin. And the reason they call him America's Chopin is he took this new music that was coming out in America. It was a folk music called ragtime, and it was developed by African American pianists. And it was originally played in saloons and places like that in the 1890s. And Scott Joplin was part of that world as a young man, and he took these folk tunes, this folk music, ragtime, and elevated it to a higher art. And Scott Joplin also wrote the first American opera, Tremonisha. So you'll have a couple of video assignments on Scott Joplin in this week's module. You'll be introduced to George Gershwin. George Gershwin was an American New Yorker. He was a great Broadway composer of the 1920s and 1930s. He lived in New York, and if the only thing George Gershwin had ever done was just write Broadway music, he would be very famous. All of his tunes, hundreds of his songs are hits. They've been covered by all kinds of artists over the decade. But George Gershwin wanted to be seen as a serious composer, like Scott Joplin. So George Gershwin, in addition to writing Broadway tunes, started writing works for orchestra. So some of the things he wrote were Rhapsody in Blue, and it's a famous orchestral work. First of all, it sounds very American. It uses jazz rhythms, jazz scales, jazz harmonies, and jazz color. He wrote a piece called American in Paris, and they made a very famous movie of it. If you ever get a chance to catch the movie, it's a great movie, and it's a musical, an old style musical, and all the music in it is George Gershwin's music. And finally, George Gershwin wrote the opera Porgy and Bess, which is the first produced American opera. Now, Scott Joplin wrote the first American opera, but Porgy and Bess is the first produced American opera, and it featured an all-black cast, a black storyline, and the music is very jazzy. And the thing with George Gershwin, the reason he was able to get his done is at the time, George Gershwin was the king of Broadway. Anything he put on Broadway was a hit. So when he said, I'd like to make an opera and put it on Broadway, people said, well, everything you've made for us, George, is a hit, so we will make this Porgy and Bess the first American produced opera. You'll be introduced to Aaron Copland, an American composer. Some of his most famous tunes are Fanfare for the Common Man, Appalachian Spring, and most importantly and most famously, music for these ballets, Rodeo and Billy the Kid. And both these are ballets that have an American West theme. The music sounds like the American West. They have cowboys in there. Billy the Kid has the Outlaws. So these are very interesting ballets. And with all three of these composers, the music is very, very American. So that's this week. You got listening activities, review activities, some video assignments, and of course our weekly discussion. So have a wonderful week, and we will see you on the flip side.